Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's Mike here at Game From Scratch, and today we are going to get about as political as this channel ever will. It's something I don't want to talk about here for the most part. This is a channel about game development. I don't want to get into social issues, I don't want to get into political issues, but this one it's relevant. It's very relevant, in fact. It's the Godot game engine just adopted a code of conduct. This is a common set of guiding principles to use for the community. So basically, if you want to participate with the Godot community, this is their stated set of common values. And these common values are also used for determining moderation. And the reality is this kind of stuff does make sense because Godot is growing and growing and growing. And when you're at a developer conference, there is a standard of behavior expected. When you are paying people to develop for your code, which is becoming more and more common, most corporations or companies will have a standard of conduct. This is just kind of codifying those things because of the growth of the Godot game engine. So we're going to go through this. We're going to go through the explanation. I will say before we jump into this, there have been some of these stories in the past that blew up spectacularly, like when the Linux operating system adapted a code of conduct. That did not go over well. But let's be honest here. A lot of that had to do with the personalities involved in that scenario and some of the history around it. This isn't the same thing. In fact, there are hundreds of codes of conduct out there. If you were with a major open source project, they have a code of conduct that is going to share 90% of the verbiage of what we're going to read today. This is just kind of a normal thing. Now, you could argue, is it necessary or is it not? And that is one for the conversations down below, but please do keep it as civil as possible. But when you get Godot growing to the state that it is, that it's having these people physically meeting up in the real world and that they're hiring people, I do think that it does make sense. So anyways, during the past 5 years of free and open source collaborative development, we've been blessed with one of the best behaved online communities that I have ever been in contact with. The vast majority of users on all our community platforms dearly care about both the Godot project itself, but also their fellow participants. Yet there are occasional outliers. To properly moderate an ever-growing community, we need a written statement for de facto guidelines that our moderation team have applied until now. This will give users a clear overview of our expectations for positive and respectful behavior. Community moderators who are also participants donating their free time to ensure a safe environment for all users will therefore be able to back their decisions with common guidelines. Well, agreed many months ago with core contributors to introduce a code of conduct to that effect. It took us a while to finally write it down and ensure that it fully described our values and expectations. Existing documents used by other projects did not fully satisfy our requirements, so we decided to write our own. Now, again, go look at Blender or Eclipse or any other really major open source project, and you're going to see these things all look very, very similar. So let's jump on over and take a look at the Godot code of conduct. So first up, we have the philosophy. I'll summarize this one instead of going through it. Basically, large community, you got to agree to a common set of guidelines to kind of keep that community alive. And even though this is a set of rules, there is a human behind these rules. So if you are a rules lawyer kind of person, this isn't about, oh, gotcha, you're out. No, there's a human interaction layer in between. So common sense can still rule the day, even if you can twist the wording of the code of conduct. Now, of course, though, if there is something in a code of conduct that can be twisted again and again or weaponized in some way so that the code of conduct team has to constantly override or deal with that, that means that wording in the code of conduct does need to be addressed. So that is one of those things that, you know, it is fair to look at from both sides. So first up, we have the expectations. This is just sort of like guiding principles. And then we have the actual rules coming down below. So first off, on expectations, politeness is expected at all time. Be kind and curious. Yeah, let's add curious there as well. Always assume positive intent from others. Be aware that differences in cultures and English proficiency make written communication more difficult than face-to-face communication, and that your interpretation of messages may not be the one the author intended. Conversely, if someone asks you to rephrase something you said, please do so without feeling judged. So this one actually kind of makes a lot of sense. There are a ton of contributors for the Godot project all over the world, and generally the language that we all communicate in is English, but a lot of those people out there necessarily have the same competency of English, or sometimes are just straight out using a translation software to communicate. When you get feedback, sometimes it looks like an attack, and all this is really saying is just give the person the benefit of the doubt. Assume that this attack isn't an attack, but it is maybe a lost in communication. And if you're that person and you said something and someone says, what? don't take that as an attack. They're just trying to clarify as well. So basically, it's common sense. Just assume the person you're talking to isn't being a dick, and if you ask them to clarify what they're talking about, you're not being a dick. That one's kind of easy to get behind. Feedback is always welcome, but your criticism, keep your criticism constructive. We encourage you to open discussions, protocols, issues, and bug reports. Use the community platforms to discuss improvements, not to vent out frustration. Similarly, when other users offer you feedback, please accept it gracefully. All right, so that's it. Now we're getting into the actual rules. Participating in a restricted conduct will lead to a warning from the community moderators and or the code of conduct team, and may lead to exclusion from the community in the form of a ban from one or all platforms. So the Godot project is committed to providing a friendly and safe environment for everyone, regardless of level of experience, gender, identity and expression, sexual orientation, disability, physical appearance, body size, race, ethnicity, language proficiency, age, political orientation, nationality, religion, or other similar characteristics. We do not tolerate harassment or discrimination of participants in any form. So in other words, if you're part of the Godot project, it is about who you are, not what you are. And it's pretty straightforward. This kind of thing is written just about everywhere. It's also the kind of thing that sets the most people off, and I hope we don't go there, to be honest. In particular, we strive to be welcoming to all industry minorities and to ensure that they can take a more active role in the community and the project. Targeted harassment of minorities is unacceptable. Okay. As a community developed project, we strive for consensus among contributors before moving forward with the proposed feature. If there is not enough support for your idea, please do not continue insisting on trying to force others into supporting your point. Features are not accepted through a voting process, so piling into a contentious feature proposal is not acceptable. This one is actually really important, and it can be a little tricky to understand. So basically, just because you submit something doesn't mean it's going to be accepted, and it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And this is where almost all large open source projects, there is a gatekeeper of source. There's a person that decides where things are going and where they aren't. And sometimes your stuff is going to get rejected. As an example, you might submit code to the Godot game engine itself that has dependencies on a non-open source library or project or something. And that's against the ethos of what Godot is all about. So they could reject it out of hand, even though you have a huge amount of the community that say want you to implement FBX support using the Autodesk SDK, for example, because you get direct binaries from Autodesk, it will work better. You will get better FBX support. But that is also 100% against the entire design philosophy of Godot. So they're just going to reject it outright. And so just be aware of that. Aggressive or offensive behavior is not acceptable. I'm going to have a little bit of a conduct after. We'll talk about this in a minute. You will be excluded from participating in the community if you insult, demean, harass, intentionally make others uncomfortable by any means, or participate in any other hateful conduct, either publicly or privately. Likewise, any spamming, trolling, flaming, baiting, or other attention-stealing behavior is not welcome and will result in exclusion from the community. So these two we're going to get back to in just a second. Any form of retaliation against a participant who contracts the code of conduct team is completely unacceptable. So if someone, reports the code of conduct violation, if you retaliate against them, that's a violation. For certainty, any conduct which could reasonably be considered inappropriate in a professional setting is not acceptable. So that is it. Here is the code of conduct team. And the only area where I'm kind of going, is the actual, probably the ones that look the most common sense that you'll see here is these two. And I think what it's going to boil down to is these just aren't going to be enforced. And the wording here is, this sounds like when you're talking to each other, but this is one of those things that the Godot community, and no offense, Godot community, and don't get me wrong, this is also the Blender community, the Unity community, the Unreal Engine community, the everything community. We can be a little caustic when talking to people that aren't in our community. And it'll be interesting to see how well this is done, especially when we get into trolling, flaming, and baiting. Because you know what? There's a lot of whole posts out there that are things like Unity sucks, use Godot, or any other game engine sucks, use Godot, or whatever. And it's like, well, are those going to be enforced? Are those going to be against the rules? At the end of the day, though, keep in mind, this is codifying expected behavior. This is codifying values. This isn't a set of rules that people are going to go around smacking people out in forums. What happens is, if there is a complaint, if there is a problem, or if there's a resolution, this is the system that is going to inform decisions at the back end. You have people, you have humans that are still going to come in and make a common sense judgment. This is just a public statement of what the guidance is behind this project. Now, again, you can totally disagree with the decisions here. You can disagree with the way this is going, and in some ways, knowing that you're not aligned with the project that you're working with is useful to know this. So, you know, it could be that your worldview beliefs don't make you compatible with the Godot development beliefs, and in which case, it's best to know that now than later, I guess. But for the most part, this is to protect people from the edge cases. So when you have people that are going to a real world environment and they're feeling berated or attacked, or, you know, this is a system for them to feel included. Or when you've got weird scenarios where they're actually hiring people and, you know, questions come up, or if you have people that are just being jerks in the community, this is a way of resolving all of those scenarios. So it's not really so much the way that it is written down here. The thing that will make this work or not work is the human interaction, how well it is enforced, how often complaints come up. And we're not getting a ton of stuff right now. It is a good community. The problem is, as a community gets bigger and bigger, the kind of edge cases, you know, maybe something happens 3 or 4 times a year, and that means next year it's going to happen, you know, 4 or 8 times a year, and then 8 or 16 times a year, and so on and so forth. And, you know, edge cases just become more and more common. So having this set of community values, it's not necessarily a bad thing. And of course, you can disagree with them, and I'd be interested to see what your take is on this. Also, what do you think of this part, spamming, trolling, and baiting, and how it applies towards the non-Godot community? And I'd love to hear your input there as well. So let's try to keep this as civil as possible down below. This is something that 99% of large open source projects have, and the majority of large corporations have as well. So it's not really anything all that exceptional that Godot has done this. There's no motivating cause behind it. This is just the way things are when you get to a certain scale. Let me know what you think. Comments down below, and I'll talk to you all later. Goodbye.